We are Raphael Historic Falconry, and we have been the English heritage falconers for 21 years. We specialise in the historical recreation of falconry and hawking in England. We perform at beautiful historic properties, including Audley House, which is stood behind me. Falconry is a story which starts in the late Roman era and continues through to the present day. It's not just a story about hunting with birds, it's a story about people, places, and of course, princely hawks. Falconry is the art of hunting with a trained bird of prey to catch live quarry. It's one of the oldest forms of hunting known to mankind. It started thousands of years ago and likely sprung from observing a wild process. It was not conceived originally as a sporting pursuit, it was about hunting for food. It was about harnessing the predatory nature of a wild raptor to catch edible birds and animals for the table. Falconry is thought to have developed thousands of years ago somewhere on the vast Central Asian plateau. It likely travelled from Asia across Europe via the old Silk routes and arrived sometime in Britain in the late Roman era. Join us on a journey through English history as we explore falconry through the ages. The Romans were not great practitioners of falconry. However, in 306 AD, Constantine the Great was declared emperor in York in succession to his father. Just a few months prior to coming to Britain, he is said to have been observed hawking in eastern provinces. Constantine grew up in the Eastern Empire, a region to which falconry is commonplace, so it's no surprise that he dabbled in the art of falconry during his youth. It is said that he was the first to hawk with the shaheen, which is a subspecies of the peregrine, and that he chose to hunt with those hawks because when he went out with his retinue, the hawks could be trained to fly above his head and to shade him from the sun as though they were a parasol. This is the first solid evidence that we have of a man stepping onto English soil with falconry knowledge. Falconry never did catch on across the Roman Empire. Perhaps because falconry was the chosen art of many of their enemies, perhaps because they preferred their arena-based entertainments. But one thing we know for sure, the Romans were very familiar with birds of prey on a spiritual basis. The Romans worshipped birds as gods, they feared them as enemies and exalted them as prophets. They believed that because of the birds' power of flight, that they were the prophets of the ruling gods and goddesses in the heavens above our head. Birds were therefore seen to be prophets or messengers of those gods. It is no wonder that the Imperial Roman army chose to march into battle with a golden eagle at its head, a symbol that was chosen by the consul Marius. It was either painted on a pennant or carved as a 3D banner, and the man who carried that was known as the aquilifer, coming from the Latin word for eagle, aquila. The old pagan Romans held the eagle as a divine creature, for their universe was divided into 3 layers: the mortal world, the underworld, and the heavens above our head. The eagle, as the king of all birds, the largest and the highest flying, was said to be the only creature that could pass through all 3 layers of the universe. That is why King of the Gods, Jupiter, chose the eagle as his personal messenger. The golden eagle occurs right across Europe and Asia, so wherever the Romans travelled and invaded and settled, they would have seen golden eagles in the sky above them, their constant heavenly protector. While the eagle was considered to be a divine prophet, there is a bird within the Roman world that was the complete opposite. Not a creature from the heavens, but a creature sent from the underworld, a creature of darkness, the owl. The owl lived in the realm of darkness and was considered to be a winged demon rather than a winged prophet. To see an owl was bad luck, and to have an owl visit your place of domestication was considered to be a bad omen. The Romans would use an owl as a weapon of intimidation. The power of Rome lied with the Council of Senates, and they were diplomatically voted for. If the council wanted to remove one of the senates, then they might send him a dead owl in a box. It was a weapon of intimidation, a threat, that if he didn't remove himself and resign, then he would face, perhaps, death. And it is a barn owl that allegedly foretold Julius Caesar his own death by appearing above a doorway through which he passed. In the post-Roman era, Britain suffered successive waves of invasion by the barbarian tribes of the European continent. They had a pre-established tradition of hunting with hawks and falcons, and so that is how falconry and hawking likely first came to Britain. It was witnessed by the Benedictine monks who were sent over to evangelise some of the North German tribes into the new religion of Christianity, and so falconry in Britain was originally described as a barbarian sport. The famous Benedictine monk, Boniface, is involved in correspondence between two Saxon kings. The first a letter to Ethelbald of Mercia from Boniface, who sends from the continent the gift of a hawk and 2 falcons as a token of his affection. The second letter is from Ethelbert II of Kent to Boniface, asking him to acquire for him a particular falcon of courageous nature that he says cannot be found in England. This tells us that falconry birds were rare and precious at this time, so rare that they were of extreme high value and given as prestigious gifts. It also reflects the fact that the foundations were being laid for hawk trade between Britain and Europe, importing birds specifically for royal pursuit. All the Saxon kings from Ethelbald of Mercia in the 8th century through to Edward the Confessor in the 11th century flew hawks and falcons. Falconry had become a new royal pursuit. Only by the 10th century did falconry start to filter down to lower members of society. Falconry expansion led to administrative and political changes that supported the practice of falconry and preserved the best sport for the kings themselves. The goshawk, or goshawk, was one of the most popular species flown. It was described as a capable slayer of ground quarry, an efficient catcher of food for the pot, and a military winged warrior. Kings would go to great lengths to preserve the safety of their hawks, even in the face of death. This is demonstrated in the Anglo-Saxon poem about the Battle of Maldon, where a young noble is about to commence battle with the Danes. As he faces his enemy, he releases his hawk to freedom, for surely he is going to die. And by releasing his hawk, she may fend for herself in the woods. This was an act of confidence and an act of defiance in the face of his enemy. The Saxon kings loved their hawks. Alfred the Great is thought to have written the first hunting manual on falconry, but no evidence of it sadly survives. Edward the Confessor was a particularly avid falconer, and we know more about the establishment of falconry under his reign than any previous king. And that's because the Domesday Book records it in great detail, an organisation and a structure that was taken on by William the Conqueror after his appearance. And last word, of course, must go to Harold Godwinson, who was very nearly King of England had he not been shot through the eye with an arrow. He is described as a little man who sat proudly in his stirrups and only ever put his hawk down when he needed both hands with which to eat. The reign of the Plantagenet kings saw hawking become a more organised method of catching food, and further expansion of falconry as a royal pursuit. We see falconry starting to filter down through to lower orders of society, to include the clergy and minor gentry and even yeomen. Ladies, for the first time, became more actively involved in the pursuit of falconry, being assigned their own delicate hawks for their gentle fists. Employment was generated by both hawking and falconry, and one could use the sport as a way to better one's life. Trade routes were established to allow people to import birds from Scandinavia, from the Mediterranean, from North Africa, and from the Near and the Far East. Falconry birds became so highly prized that they effectively became a form of currency. They were used to trade and barter for goods, to pay ransoms and fines and rent, to be given as very valuable gifts and as tokens of noblemen's affections. Falconry was socially, culturally and economically important. The Middle Ages were the Golden Age. English medieval falconry mentions the peregrine falcon and the lanner falcon most frequently, our two largest native species of falcon at that time. The peregrine was plentiful and very good for catching medium-sized birds. However, it was frequently lost and sadly very expensive. The lanner falcon was comparatively much more affordable and a great deal more reliable. It is known to have bred here in the British Isles, in the south and the west during the Middle Ages. Never very common, but most certainly recorded as being there. It was nicknamed the partridge hawk and was used to catch medium-sized game birds. Gentlemen who could not afford a tiercel, that is a male peregrine falcon, would instead make do with a lanner or lanneret. The word lanner derives from the old French word lanière, which means coward, and relates to the sneaky ambush-style hunting tactics that the lanner is famous for. Lanner falcons are soft-feathered and prefer warm conditions, so did not make good winter hunting birds. They were, however, very reliable and seldom lost. A slight temperature cooling that started in the first half of the Middle Ages resulted in the lanner falcons slowly dying out, and by the early 1700s they had all but disappeared from the British Isles. They retreated back to the warmth of the Mediterranean and Africa, where they are still found today. The famous Book of St Albans, written by Dame Juliana Berners and published in 1485, very famously tells us that there was status among hawks as there was among men. It lists each station of person's socially appropriate hawk, and within that list it tells us that for a lady there is a merlin. The merlin was the most popular hunting bird for noble ladies during the medieval period. It is a small and delicate falcon, perfect for a lady's fist. They're quite a sociable and pleasant little bird to handle, and with time and care they become even more sociable through time. A lady would hunt and fly her merlin from horseback. The merlin derives its name from the old French Norman word emerillon, which means to swivel or to twist, and it relates to the ringing style of flight that the merlin conducts, to match the equally ringing style flight of its primary quarry, which was the skylark. Lark hawking was a very popular medieval sport among ladies and lesser nobles. By the 16th century, to practice falconry was indicative of nobility. The pomp and ceremony of social hunts was a piece of public theatre and would empty the coffers of whichever noble the hunt processed through. Falconry had become the pursuit of the ruling classes, a privilege which was supported by law. Henry VIII declared that no man may take a hawk from an English nest, or eyrie as it was called, without the sovereign's express permission. If an applicant failed to win approval, he would have no choice but to arrange the import of a hawk from abroad, at great expense. Henry VIII came to falconry in his later years, after retiring from jousting due to injury. He kept his hawks and his falcons at Charing Cross in London and also at Hampton Court Palace, and he hunted in the great parks in the London environs. He very famously almost drowned whilst out hawking one day in Hitchin near Hertfordshire in 1525. He was rescued by a single solitary footman who had accompanied him on that visit, a man who was later rewarded and promoted for his service. Henry was said to favour the peregrine falcon. However, publicly he became more closely associated with the falcon argent, or the silver or white falcon as it was known. When Anne Boleyn was crowned queen, Henry granted her use of the personal motif of the white falcon, wearing a crown, holding a sceptre in its foot, and perched upon a stump from which roses were blooming forth. It was a symbolic statement that Anne was of noble descent, that her authority was granted by God, and that hope sprung forth for the future, presumably alluding to the production of a son and heir. The white falcon was the Gyrfalcon, sometimes called the Greenland falcon in history. It is the largest and most powerful species of falcon in the world, and particularly good for flying at large, powerful, high-flying game. It was a popular choice of the medieval kings, but famously became the most favourable hunting bird of Tudor nobility. The medieval kings hunted crane and heron with their gyrfalcons, but these large water birds were now much rarer. The Tudors instead turned to hunting a more abundant quarry species, one that was high-flying and would encourage their gyrfalcons to climb to dizzying heights. That quarry was the red kite. There were more than 500,000 red kite in Tudor England, and because they were not a falconry suitable bird, they were instead a scavenger, they were classed as vermin. There was no domestic breeding of hawks in history, and so gyrfalcons had to be sourced from their countries of origin, from Scandinavia, from Greenland and from Iceland. Obtaining them from their countries of origin was dangerous and expensive. Tsar Ivan the Terrible is alleged to have gifted a consignment of gyrfalcons to Anne Boleyn to win the favour of Henry VIII, and that consignment had an estimated equivalent modern-day value of £500,000. There was no higher prize and no higher gift than that of a white falcon. The last great royal falconry tournament in English history, which included kite hawking, was staged at Newmarket in 1642 between Louis XIII and James I. His successor, Charles I, of course, lost his head, and so falconry for the first time lost royal support. The English Civil War prevented falconry from being practised at all, and was only briefly restored during the later Restoration period. But the English falconry that reappeared was never the same again. Technology spelled disaster for English falconry. Handheld weapons rendered hawks redundant, for guns were cheaper and easier than keeping hawks and falcons. The new fashion for the shotgun pushed falconry into the shadows, and it was at very serious risk of becoming extinct. So by the late 18th century, there were very few falconers left in Britain. A very wise man called Colonel Thornton in 1775 decided to try and protect falconry knowledge. He established a falconry club called the Confederate Hawks of Great Britain, and it was a wonderful way of gathering and collating precious information and sharing it with paid subscribers. This started a new fashion for falconry club, and several clubs later, and by the late Victorian age, falconry had once again been put back on the English country sporting map. For the first time in several hundred years, there were once again professional falconers in the service of titled gentlemen. There were hawks and falcons being flown over traditional hunting lands, and men and women clad in their tweed were once again seen out in the countryside with their hawks, their horses and their dogs. The social importance of falconry may well have changed, but the technical practice of it had not. The most popular falconry bird of Victorian England was unquestionably the peregrine falcon, just like my friend Fury here on my fist. Other species of falcon had fallen out of fashion. The lanner falcons and the saker falcons that had filled the medieval skies were no longer popular hunting birds. They were considered to be too soft-feathered and more suitable for warm climates. They didn't cope well with the cold, damp British winters, and so they became redundant. The gyrfalcon that our medieval kings and our Tudor gentlemen had hunted with also were falling out of fashion because they had no natural quarry that they could hunt for anymore. The large waterfowl that they were hunted against in earlier centuries had become rare due to land use change, and the red kite that they were later hunted against had almost become extinct across the British Isles. The merlin remained a popular hunting bird for ladies and young gentlemen. and well-bred young boys would often be gifted a kestrel as their first hawk with which to learn the rudiments of the art of falconry. The kestrel is a marvellous little falcon, and even grown men become very fondly attached to their small hawks. Every Victorian gentleman would look forward excitedly to the 12th of August, which was the opening of the game season. Under the 1831 Game Act, the 12th of August was the start of the grouse season, and the wealthiest gentlemen would be invited to travel north to Scotland to hunt their peregrines over the grouse moors. Those falconers who were not lucky enough to receive an invitation to the north would have to make do with the partridge estates of the Midlands and the east of England. And Audley End House, where we're now stood, was once considered to be the finest partridge estate in the whole of Victorian England. In the 1890s, Lord Howard de Walden rented this property, and he hunted with his peregrines at partridge over these very lands. The peregrine falcon defines English falconry, past, present, and hopefully future. We are Raphael Historic Falconry, and we hope that you've enjoyed your journey through the ages with us and our hawks.